The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Clarence House as King Charles III stood at his study window, his weathered hands clasped tightly behind his back. The weight of the crown had changed him in ways he never anticipated, and, today, that change would ripple through his personal relationships in the most unexpected manner. Camilla had been his anchor through decades of public scrutiny, private heartbreak, and the tumultuous journey to acceptance by both the royal family and the British people. Their love story, once scandalous, had evolved into a partnership that many admired. Yet on this particular morning, something had shifted in the very foundation of their world. The previous evening had been meant as a celebration. Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's eldest son, had achieved a significant milestone in his culinary career, and Laura Lopez, her daughter, had just announced her latest charitable endeavor. The Parker Bowles family had gathered at a private club in Mayfair, expecting the usual warmth and inclusion they had grown accustomed to since Charles and Camilla's marriage. But Charles had not appeared. No phone call, no message through his private secretary, no acknowledgement whatsoever. The absence was so stark, so unlike the man who had gradually embraced Camilla's children as his own, that it left everyone bewildered and hurt. Camilla herself had tried to maintain composure throughout the evening, making excuses for her husband's absence that grew thinner with each passing hour. She spoke of urgent royal duties, unexpected meetings, and pressing state matters. But those who knew her well could see the confusion and growing concern in her eyes. The truth was far more complex than anyone at that dinner could have imagined. Earlier that day, Charles had received a private briefing from his most trusted advisors about matters that would challenge everything he thought he knew about loyalty, family, and the delicate balance between personal happiness and royal duty. The briefing had taken place in the morning room at Buckingham Palace, a space that had witnessed countless historical moments. Present were Sir Clive Alderton, Charles's private secretary, and Dame Rebecca Deacon, a trusted advisor who had served the royal family for over 2 decades. The conversation that unfolded would explain Charles's sudden and inexplicable coldness toward Camilla's family. "Your Majesty," Sir Clive had begun, his voice carrying an unusual tension. "We have received information that requires your immediate attention. It concerns the Parker Bowles family and certain activities that have come to light." Charles had looked up from the state papers he was reviewing, his reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose. The morning had been routine until that moment, reviewing correspondence, planning upcoming engagements, discussing environmental initiatives that remained close to his heart. "What sort of activities?" Charles had asked, though something in Sir Clive's demeanor already suggested this was not a matter of minor concern. Dame Rebecca had stepped forward, carrying a folder marked with the highest security classifications. "We have credible evidence that suggests certain members of the Queen Consort's family have been engaged in activities that could potentially compromise the monarchy's reputation and security." The words had hung in the air like a physical presence. Charles had felt his world tilt slightly, the familiar surroundings of the palace suddenly seeming foreign and cold. This was the conversation he had never wanted to have, the scenario that had played out in his worst nightmares during the early days of his relationship with Camilla. "Be specific," Charles had said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that had developed since his accession to the throne. Sir Clive had opened the folder and begun reading from classified intelligence reports. The information detailed financial irregularities, questionable business associations, and communications that suggested the Parker Bowles family might have been exploiting their connection to the royal family for personal gain. The allegations were serious enough to warrant investigation by both domestic intelligence services and specialized units within the Metropolitan Police. Phone calls had been monitored, financial records examined, and business dealings scrutinized with the kind of thoroughness typically reserved for matters of national security. Charles had listened in stunned silence as the evidence was laid before him. Bank transfers that coincided with royal events, meetings with individuals whose backgrounds raised red flags, and communications that suggested advanced knowledge of royal schedules, and private information that should not have been accessible to anyone outside the immediate royal household. "How long has this investigation been ongoing?" Charles had asked, his voice betraying none of the turmoil that was building inside him. "Approximately 6 weeks," Dame Rebecca had replied. "We wanted to be absolutely certain of our facts before bringing this to your attention. The implications, as you can understand, are far-reaching." The king had stood and walked to the window, looking out at the tourists gathering outside the palace gates. These people looked to the monarchy for stability, tradition, and moral leadership. The idea that his own family might be undermining those very principles was almost too much to bear. "Does the Queen Consort know?" he had asked. "There is no evidence to suggest Her Majesty is aware of these activities," Sir Clive had assured him. "However, the investigation is ongoing, and we cannot be certain what information might come to light." Charles had turned back to face his advisors, his expression hardening in a way that those who worked closely with him rarely witnessed. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The loving stepfather was receding, replaced by the sovereign who understood that the crown demanded sacrifices that extended far beyond personal happiness. "What are my options?" he had asked. Dame Rebecca had outlined the possibilities. A quiet investigation could continue, with the family members in question being monitored but not confronted. Alternatively, immediate action could be taken to distance the royal family from any potential scandal, which would mean cutting ties with the Parker Bowles family entirely. There was also a middle path, a gradual cooling of relationships that would send a clear message without the dramatic implications of a complete break. This option would protect the monarchy, while potentially salvaging something of the family dynamic that had taken years to build. Charles had considered each option carefully, weighing the personal cost against his duty as sovereign. The conversation had lasted nearly 2 hours, with additional advisors brought in to discuss security implications, media management strategies, and the potential constitutional ramifications of any decision. By the end of the meeting, Charles had made his choice. It was not a decision made in anger or haste, but rather the calculated response of a monarch who understood that personal relationships could not be allowed to compromise the institution he had sworn to protect. The immediate implementation of his decision meant that all social engagements involving the Parker Bowles family would be quietly canceled. No explanations would be offered, no accusations made. The silence would speak volumes to those who needed to understand the message, while providing plausible deniability to the press and public. As the afternoon had progressed, Charles had found himself unable to focus on his usual duties. The weight of what he had learned, and what he had decided to do about it, pressed down on him with an intensity he had not experienced since the darkest days following Diana's death. He had canceled his evening engagement, the celebration that was meant to honor Tom's achievements and Laura's charitable work. The decision had been communicated through his private secretary with the brief explanation that urgent state business required his immediate attention. Now, as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, Charles remained at his window, contemplating the far-reaching consequences of his actions. He knew that Camilla would seek explanations, that the family would be hurt and confused by his sudden absence from their lives. But he also knew that the crown demanded absolute loyalty, not just from himself, but from all those who moved within its orbit. If members of Camilla's family had indeed betrayed that trust, then they would have to face the consequences, regardless of the personal cost to him or to his wife. The silence he had chosen was not born of cruelty, but of necessity. It was the response of a king who understood that sometimes the most difficult decisions were also the most essential ones for protecting the institution that millions of people around the world looked to for stability and continuity. As he prepared for the difficult conversations that lay ahead, Charles reflected on how quickly trust could be shattered and how the actions of a few individuals could threaten the carefully constructed relationships that had taken decades to build. The morning had brought clarity, but it had also brought a profound sense of isolation that he suspected would define the coming weeks and months. The king's silence would soon become the subject of intense speculation, but only a select few would ever know the true reasons behind his dramatic change in behavior toward the family he had once embraced as his own. The silence stretched into its third day, and Camilla could no longer pretend that her husband's behavior was simply the result of royal obligations. She had lived through enough royal crises to recognize when something fundamental had shifted in the carefully orchestrated world they inhabited together. Sitting in her private drawing room at Clarence House, surrounded by the personal mementos and photographs that made this space feel like home, Camilla stared at her phone screen. 3 missed calls to Charles's private line, each one going directly to voicemail. Her text messages remained unread, showing only a single gray checkmark that indicated they had been sent, but not received. The Queen Consort had weathered many storms throughout her relationship with Charles. She had endured years of public vilification, death threats, and the constant comparison to Diana. She had learned to navigate the complex protocols of royal life, to balance her role as wife and stepmother with the demands of her position as future Queen Consort. But nothing had prepared her for this. the complete emotional withdrawal of the man she had loved for over 3 decades. Tom had called that morning, his voice tight with concern and barely concealed anger. The celebration 3 nights ago had been meant as a family gathering, a rare opportunity for the Parker Bowles clan to come together without the usual royal protocols and press attention. Charles's absence had cast a shadow over the entire evening that no amount of forced merriment could dispel. "Mom, what's really going on?" Tom had asked during their phone conversation. "I've never seen him behave like this. Not even during the worst of the Diana years did he just disappear without explanation." Camilla had found herself unable to provide answers because she simply didn't have them. Charles had left for the palace 3 mornings ago for what he described as routine meetings, kissing her goodbye with the same gentle affection that had characterized their mornings for years. When he returned that evening, something had fundamentally changed. The transformation had been subtle at first. Charles had been quieter during dinner, more withdrawn than usual. She had attributed it to the pressures of kingship, the endless stream of decisions and responsibilities that weighed on him daily. But when she had tried to discuss the upcoming family celebration, his response had been distant, almost cold. "I may not be able to attend," he had said, not meeting her eyes. "There are pressing matters that require my attention." When she had pressed him for details, he had simply excused himself and retired to his study, claiming he had papers to review. That night, he had slept in the guest bedroom, citing concerns about disturbing her with his late-night work schedule. Laura had been equally bewildered when she called the following day. Her daughter had always enjoyed a warm relationship with Charles, who had walked her down the aisle at her wedding and taken genuine interest in her children's lives. The sudden silence was particularly painful for Laura, who had been looking forward to sharing news of her latest charitable initiative with her stepfather. "He's always been so supportive," Laura had confided to her mother during their conversation. "Remember how he helped me with the funding applications for the literacy program? He spent hours going through the proposals with me, offering suggestions and connecting me with potential donors. This silence feels like a complete rejection of everything we've built together." The pain in her daughter's voice had cut through Camilla like a physical wound. She had worked so hard to integrate her children into Charles's world, to create a blended family that could function within the unique constraints of royal life. The progress had been slow but steady, marked by small victories and growing trust on all sides. Now it felt as though years of careful relationship building were being swept away by forces she couldn't understand or control. The silence was not just Charles's withdrawal from her family. It was the systematic erasure of connections that had taken decades to establish. Camilla's attempts to reach Charles through official channels had been equally unsuccessful. His private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, had been politely evasive when she called, citing the king's heavy schedule and the confidential nature of current state business. Even Dame Sarah, Charles's longtime personal assistant, had been unable to provide any insight into his sudden change in behavior. "His Majesty has been in meetings all day," Dame Sarah had explained when Camilla called the palace directly. "I'm afraid his schedule is completely booked through the end of the week. Would you like me to see if we can arrange a brief call this evening?" But the promised call never came. Charles returned to Clarence's house each night, but he might as well have been a stranger. He spoke only when necessary, avoided eye contact, and seemed to have erected an invisible barrier between himself and everyone around him. The palace staff had begun to notice the tension. Mrs. Henderson, their longtime housekeeper, had mentioned to Camilla that His Majesty had requested all his meals be served in his private study. The couple's traditional evening tea in the garden room had been quietly canceled, with no explanation offered. Even more telling was Charles's sudden change in his daily routine. For years, he had begun each morning by reading selected newspaper clippings while Camilla reviewed her correspondence over coffee. They would discuss the day's schedule, upcoming engagements, and personal matters in the comfortable intimacy that had developed over decades of partnership. Now Charles left the house before dawn, returning only after Camilla had retired for the evening. When their paths did cross in the hallways of Clarence's house, he offered only the most perfunctory greetings before hurrying away to his private quarters. The Queen Consort found herself analyzing every interaction from the past month, searching for clues that might explain the dramatic change in her husband's behavior. Had she said something inappropriate? Had her family committed some unknown transgression that warranted this level of royal displeasure? Her mind kept returning to a conversation she had overheard several weeks ago between Charles and Sir Clive. They had been speaking in low voices in the library, and she had caught only fragments of their discussion as she passed by in the hallway. Something about family security and necessary precautions had been mentioned, but she had thought nothing of it at the time. Royal security was a constant concern, with regular briefings and updates on potential threats. It was not unusual for Charles to have confidential discussions with his advisors about protective measures for various family members. But now those overheard phrases took on a more ominous significance. Camilla decided to reach out to Anne, Charles's sister, hoping that the Princess Royal might have some insight into her brother's behavior, and had always been direct and honest, qualities that Camilla had come to appreciate during family gatherings and official events. The call was answered immediately, but Anne's response was not encouraging. "I've noticed he's been different," the Princess Royal admitted. "More guarded, even in family meetings. When I asked him directly if something was wrong, he just said he was dealing with sensitive matters that couldn't be discussed." "Has he mentioned my family at all?" Camilla asked, though she dreaded the answer. There was a long pause before Anne responded. "Camilla, I think you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that this silence isn't random. Charles doesn't make decisions like this lightly, especially when it comes to family relationships. If he's pulling away, there's usually a very specific reason." The conversation had ended with Anne promising to try to speak with her brother, but Camilla held little hope that even the Princess Royal would be able to penetrate whatever wall Charles had constructed around himself. As evening approached, Camilla found herself standing in the same spot where Charles had stood just days earlier, looking out at the gardens they had redesigned together shortly after their marriage. The carefully planned flower beds and walking paths represented their shared vision of creating a private sanctuary within the public world they inhabited. Now even this space felt contaminated by the growing distance between them. Every shared memory seemed tainted by the possibility that their life together might be fundamentally changing in ways she could never have anticipated. The sound of Charles's car arriving in the courtyard broke through her reverie. She listened to his footsteps in the entrance hall, the familiar pattern that usually brought her comfort. Tonight, however, the sound seemed to emphasize his determination to avoid any contact with her. She heard him speaking briefly with the duty equerry, his voice carrying the formal tone he used during official engagements. There was no warmth, no hint of the private man she had fallen in love with all those years ago when they were both young, and the future seemed so much simpler. Camilla remained at the window as the house settled into evening quiet. Whatever forces had been set in motion 3 days ago were still gathering strength, and she was beginning to realize that her husband's silence might not be temporary. The king she had married was disappearing, replaced by a sovereign whose duties apparently required the sacrifice of personal relationships she had thought were unshakable. The chilling realization that she might be witnessing the systematic destruction of her family's place in royal life began to take hold. Tomorrow would bring new attempts to understand what had gone wrong, but tonight she could only stand in the growing darkness and wonder if the love that had sustained them through so many trials would be strong enough to survive whatever crisis was now threatening to tear them apart. The breakthrough came on a rain-soaked Thursday morning when Camilla made an unexpected decision that would force the confrontation both she and Charles had been avoiding. She arrived unannounced at Buckingham Palace, bypassing the usual protocols that governed even her movements as queen consort. Sir Clive Alderton was visibly uncomfortable when she appeared in the outer office of the king's private suite, her presence disrupting the carefully managed schedule that had been designed to keep her and Charles apart. The private secretary's usual composure faltered as he realized that the queen consort was not going to be easily dismissed with vague explanations about urgent state business. "Your Majesty," Sir Clive began, rising from his desk with obvious nervousness. "His Majesty is currently in a classified briefing with the intelligence services. I'm afraid he cannot be disturbed under any circumstances." Camilla's expression remained calm, but there was steel in her voice that palace staff rarely heard. "Then, I'll wait," she said, settling into one of the formal chairs in the antechamber. "However long it takes." The standoff lasted for over an hour. Palace staff moved around her with the careful deference reserved for senior royals, but everyone could feel the tension radiating from the usually composed queen consort. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, projecting an image of patient determination that made it clear she would not be moved. When Charles finally emerged from his meeting, he found his wife waiting for him with the kind of quiet resolve that he recognized from their most difficult conversations over the years. The intelligence officials filing past her avoided eye contact, clearly uncomfortable with the domestic drama playing out in the heart of the British government's most secure facility. "Camilla," Charles said, his voice carefully neutral, "I wasn't expecting you." Clearly, she replied, standing to face him. We need to talk, Charles. Now. The king glanced at Sir Clive, who was hovering nearby with obvious anxiety about the breach in protocol. Perhaps we could schedule a proper meeting later this week when my diary allows, Charles suggested, but his tone lacked conviction. No, Camilla said firmly. Not later this week, not tomorrow, not in an hour. Right now, in your private office, with no staff and no interruptions. The moment stretched between them, heavy with implications that extended far beyond a marital disagreement. Palace employees throughout the corridor had found urgent business elsewhere, sensing the explosive potential of the confrontation they were witnessing. Charles finally nodded, leading his wife into his private study and closing the door behind them. The room that had witnessed countless historical decisions was about to become the setting for a conversation that would determine the future of their marriage and the stability of the modern monarchy. Camilla didn't wait for Charles to speak first. The week of silence and uncertainty had stripped away her usual diplomatic approach, leaving behind a directness that surprised even her. What have my children done? She asked, her voice cutting through the formal atmosphere of the room. What could Tom or Laura possibly have done to warrant this level of punishment? Charles moved to his desk, but didn't sit down, his body language defensive and uncertain. For the first time in days, the mask of royal composure slipped slightly, revealing glimpses of the internal conflict he had been battling. It's complicated, he began, but Camilla cut him off with a gesture that was both dismissive and commanding. Don't you dare give me the same diplomatic nonsense you've been feeding your staff, she said. I've spent 20 years learning to navigate the complexities of royal life. I've endured death threats, public humiliation, and constant scrutiny because I believed in us, in our life together. I deserve the truth. The king walked to the window, the same movement he had made in countless other moments of crisis throughout his life. But, this time, the view of the palace gardens offered no comfort or clarity. There's an ongoing investigation, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Intelligence services have uncovered activities involving your family that could potentially compromise the security and reputation of the crown. Camilla felt as though the floor had shifted beneath her feet. The words were so unexpected, so completely at odds with everything she thought she knew about her children, that she struggled to process their meaning. What kind of activities? She demanded, moving closer to Charles despite his obvious desire to maintain distance. Charles turned back to face her, and, for the first time, she could see the pain and conflict in his eyes. This was not the cold, calculating monarch who had been avoiding her for the past week. This was the man she had fallen in love with, tortured by circumstances beyond his control. Financial irregularities, he said, his voice gaining strength as he began to share the burden he had been carrying alone. Questionable business relationships. Communications that suggest they may have been exploiting their connection to the royal family for personal gain. The accusations hung in the air between them like physical barriers. Camilla's mind raced through recent conversations with Tom and Laura, searching for any hint of the behavior Charles was describing. She thought of Tom's restaurant ventures, his television appearances, his cookbook deals. She considered Laura's charitable work, her art gallery connections, her social circle. Show me, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her thoughts. Show me this evidence that has convinced you to destroy our family. Charles hesitated, clearly struggling with the breach of security protocols that sharing classified information would represent. But the look in his wife's eyes made it clear that their marriage hung in the balance of his next decision. He moved to his secure filing cabinet, removing a folder marked with the highest classification levels. As he opened it on his desk, Camilla could see photographs, financial documents, transcripts of phone conversations, and detailed surveillance reports. This investigation has been ongoing for 2 months, Charles explained as Camilla studied the materials. MI5 began looking into your family's activities after irregular patterns were detected in financial monitoring systems. The documents painted a disturbing picture. Bank transfers that coincided with major royal announcements, suggesting advanced knowledge of confidential information. Business meetings with individuals whose backgrounds raised serious security concerns. Phone conversations that implied Tom and Laura were leveraging their royal connections in ways that crossed ethical and potentially legal boundaries. Camilla read through transcript after transcript, each one revealing a side of her children she had never seen or suspected. Tom discussing inside information about royal schedules with business partners. Laura arranging introductions between foreign nationals and minor royals, apparently in exchange for significant financial compensation. How long have you known about this? Camilla asked, her voice hollow as the full scope of the allegations became clear. I was briefed 6 days ago, Charles replied. The same morning I decided I couldn't attend Tom's celebration. I couldn't sit at a table with them, knowing what I knew, pretending everything was normal. The queen consort continued reading, her face growing paler with each page. The evidence was comprehensive and damning, built on months of careful surveillance and financial analysis. Phone calls had been recorded, email communications intercepted, and financial records subpoenaed from multiple banks and investment firms. One particularly devastating transcript showed Tom discussing his ability to arrange private audiences with senior royals in exchange for substantial payments to his business ventures. Another revealed Laura's involvement in facilitating meetings between foreign dignitaries and members of the royal household, with significant sums of money changing hands through various intermediary accounts. Do they know they're being investigated? Camilla asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. Not yet, Charles replied. The decision was made to continue surveillance before determining how to proceed. Your silence, your reaction, could be crucial in determining whether this remains a security matter or becomes a criminal investigation. The implications were staggering. Camilla realized that her husband was not just dealing with a family crisis, but with a potential scandal that could damage the monarchy's reputation for generations. The accusations against her children were serious enough to warrant prosecution under various security and fraud statutes. What happens now? She asked, closing the folder and looking directly at Charles for the first time since their confrontation began. That depends partly on you, Charles said, his voice carrying the weight of his position as both husband and sovereign. The intelligence services need to know whether you had any knowledge of these activities, whether you might have inadvertently provided information that facilitated them. The question hit Camilla like a physical blow. Not only were her children suspected of exploiting their royal connections, but she herself was now under implicit suspicion as a potential accomplice or unwitting source of classified information. You think I might be involved? She asked, incredulity mixing with hurt in her voice. I don't want to think it, Charles replied honestly. But I have to consider every possibility. The crown's security cannot be compromised by personal feelings, even my own. The conversation continued for another hour, with Charles sharing additional details from the investigation and Camilla absorbing the full scope of the crisis facing their family. By the end, both of them understood that their relationship had been fundamentally altered by forces neither of them could fully control. As Camilla prepared to leave the palace, she realized that the man she had married was disappearing before her eyes, replaced by a sovereign whose first loyalty was to the institution rather than to the people he loved. The silence that had driven her to confront him was beginning to make a terrible kind of sense. The rain had stopped by the time she reached her car, but the storm that was about to engulf their family was just beginning to gather strength. The confrontation Camilla had been dreading came 2 days later when she sat across from Tom and Laura in the private dining room at Clarence's house. The intelligence briefing Charles had shared with her lay heavy on her conscience, but she knew that approaching her children without careful consideration could jeopardize the ongoing investigation and potentially implicate her as an accomplice. Tom arrived first, his usual cheerful demeanor noticeably strained. The successful chef and food critic had built his career on charm and authenticity, but today his smile seemed forced and uncertain. He had been calling constantly since Charles's unexplained absence from the family celebration, and his mother's evasive responses had only increased his anxiety. Laura followed shortly after, bringing with her an air of barely concealed frustration that had been building throughout the week. As an art gallery owner and philanthropist, she was accustomed to navigating complex social and business relationships, but the sudden silence from her stepfather had left her feeling confused and professionally vulnerable. Mom, we need to understand what's happening, Tom began before they had even finished their greetings. This isn't just about hurt feelings anymore. People are starting to ask questions about why Charles has suddenly disappeared from our lives. Camilla had spent the previous evening planning this conversation, trying to find a way to probe for information without revealing what she knew about the investigation. The balance was delicate, too direct, and she might compromise the security operation, too indirect, and she might miss crucial details that could help her understand the full scope of her children's activities. Tell me about your recent business dealings, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Both of you. I want to understand what might have changed in the past few months. Laura exchanged a glance with her brother, and Camilla caught a flicker of something that might have been guilt or recognition. The moment was brief, but it was enough to confirm her worst fears about the accuracy of the intelligence reports Charles had shared. What do you mean, specifically? Laura asked, her tone defensive. I mean, any new clients, any unusual opportunities, anything that might have brought you into contact with people Charles might find concerning, Camilla replied, watching her daughter's reaction carefully. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Camilla noticed that he avoided meeting her eyes directly. When he spoke, his usual confident tone was replaced by something that sounded almost rehearsed. There have been some new opportunities, he admitted. Restaurant investors, television production companies, publishing deals. Nothing out of the ordinary for someone in my position. But Camilla had heard the transcripts of Tom's phone conversations, and she knew that his definition of ordinary had apparently expanded to include activities that crossed serious ethical boundaries. The investigation had revealed his involvement in arranging private dining experiences for wealthy foreign nationals, with access to royal residences and senior family members being part of the package he offered. What about the Meridian Group? She asked, naming one of the investment firms that had appeared repeatedly in the intelligence files. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Both Tom and Laura tensed visibly, and the pretense of innocent confusion evaporated. Camilla realized that by mentioning a specific name from the classified investigation, she had revealed her knowledge of details that should have been known only to security services. How do you know about Meridian? Laura asked, her voice sharp with sudden alarm. The question hung between them, heavy with implications that extended far beyond family loyalty. Camilla understood that her next words would determine not only the course of this conversation, but potentially the future of her relationship with her children and her position within the royal family. Because Charles knows about it, she said finally, deciding that honesty was the only path forward. There's an investigation, Laura. Both of you are being watched by MI5. The silence that followed was profound and telling. Neither Tom nor Laura expressed surprise or outrage at the accusation. Instead, they exchanged looks that confirmed their awareness of activities that had caught the attention of the intelligence services. Tom was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. How much does he know? The question revealed everything. Not denial, not anger at false accusations, but concern about the extent of royal knowledge regarding their activities. Camilla felt her heart break as she realized that the children she had raised and protected for decades had indeed been exploiting their connection to the crown for financial gain. Everything, she replied, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil. Phone calls, financial records, business meetings, all of it. They've been watching you for months. Laura's composure finally cracked, and tears began streaming down her face. We never meant for it to go this far, she said. It started small, just making introductions, helping people with legitimate business interests. But then, the money became too tempting, and we convinced ourselves we weren't really doing anything wrong. Tom nodded, his earlier defensiveness replaced by what appeared to be genuine remorse. The Meridian deal was supposed to be our last big score, he admitted. We were planning to step back after that, maybe even come clean about some of the gray area activities we'd been involved in. Camilla listened in growing horror as her children detailed a network of financial arrangements that had exploited royal access and information for personal profit. Tom's restaurant ventures had become fronts for arranging private meetings between foreign investors and minor royals. Laura's art gallery had facilitated money laundering operations disguised as legitimate art transactions. The scope of their activities was far more extensive than even the intelligence reports had suggested. They had been operating for over 3 years, building relationships with individuals and organizations whose interests often conflicted with British foreign policy and security concerns. Do you understand what you've done? Camilla asked, her voice breaking with emotion. Do you realize that you've potentially compromised not just your own futures, but the security of the entire royal family? Laura sobbed openly now, the weight of their actions finally sinking in. We thought we were being careful, she said. We had lawyers, accountants, people who assured us everything was legal and above board. But Tom's expression suggested a different level of understanding about the gravity of their situation. The people we've been dealing with, he said slowly. Some of them aren't just business people, are they? The intelligence services wouldn't be involved unless there were national security implications. Camilla confirmed their worst fears. Some of your contacts are suspected of connections to foreign intelligence services. Others have ties to organized crime syndicates. You've potentially been used as unwitting assets in operations targeting the British government. The revelation was devastating. Both Tom and Laura had believed they were simply capitalizing on their unique position within British society, never considering that they might be pawns in larger schemes designed to compromise the monarchy and gather intelligence on government activities. What happens now? Tom asked, his voice hollow with the realization that their actions might have consequences extending far beyond their immediate family. Camilla explained the options as Charles had outlined them to her. The investigation could continue until sufficient evidence was gathered for criminal prosecution. Alternatively, if they cooperated fully and provided complete disclosure of their activities, there might be possibilities for resolving the situation without public scandal or imprisonment. Charles wants to protect the monarchy above all else, she said. If you can help intelligence services understand the full scope of what's been happening, if you can provide information that helps them assess any damage that might have been done, there might be a way forward that doesn't destroy everyone involved. But the cost would be enormous. Tom and Laura would have to cease all questionable activities immediately, surrender complete financial records to investigators, and potentially serve as ongoing sources of information about the individuals and organizations they had been involved with. Most difficult of all, they would have to accept that their relationship with Charles might never recover. The king's trust, once broken on matters of national security, was not something that could be easily repaired. He really believes we're traitors, doesn't he? Laura asked, her voice barely audible. Camilla considered the question carefully before answering. I think he believes you're people who made terrible choices without fully understanding the consequences. Whether that's something he can forgive, I honestly don't know. The conversation continued for several more hours, with Tom and Laura gradually revealing additional details about their activities that painted an even more troubling picture than the intelligence services had uncovered. By the end, Camilla understood that her children's situation was far more serious than she had initially realized, and that Charles's cold silence was perhaps the kindest response possible under the circumstances. As her children prepared to leave, both of them seemed to understand that their lives were about to change in fundamental ways. The family relationships they had taken for granted, the royal connections that had provided them with opportunities and social status, the comfortable assumption that their positions were secure, all of it was now in jeopardy. Will you tell Charles that we want to make this right? Tom asked as he prepared to leave. Camilla nodded, though she suspected that her husband's definition of making it right might be very different from her son's understanding of the phrase. The silence that had begun a week earlier was starting to feel like it might become permanent, and she was beginning to wonder whether the love that had sustained their family through so many challenges would be strong enough to survive the crisis that was still unfolding. 6 weeks had passed since the intelligence briefing that shattered Charles's trust in Camilla's family, and the palace corridors buzzed with whispered speculation about the ongoing crisis. The king's silence toward the Parker Bowles family had become an open secret among senior staff, though the true reasons remained known only to a select few with the highest security clearances. Sir Clive Alderton carried the weight of managing the fallout from what had become the most serious security breach involving the royal family in decades. The investigation had expanded far beyond Tom and Laura's activities, uncovering a network of compromised individuals and organizations that threatened the very foundation of the monarchy's security protocols. The morning briefing in the king's private study had become a daily ritual of damage assessment and crisis management. Dame Rebecca Deacon laid out intelligence reports that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of how deeply foreign interests had penetrated royal circles through the Parker Bowles connection. Your Majesty, we've identified at least 12 foreign nationals with suspected intelligence connections who gained access to royal events through arrangements made by your stepchildren, Dame Rebecca reported. 3 separate governments appear to have been running parallel operations to gather information about British foreign policy through this channel. Charles listened with the stoic expression he had perfected during weeks of devastating revelations. Each new briefing brought fresh evidence of how thoroughly his family's trust had been exploited by hostile forces seeking to compromise British interests. What's the current assessment of damage to national security? The king asked, though he dreaded the answer. Sir Clive consulted his classified notes before responding. Preliminary analysis suggests that sensitive information about upcoming state visits, trade negotiations, and defense policy discussions may have been compromised. The full extent won't be known until we complete debriefing all involved parties. The investigation had revealed that Tom's restaurant business had become an elaborate front for intelligence-gathering operations. Private dining events at exclusive venues had provided cover for foreign agents to record conversations with minor royals, government officials, and business leaders who assumed they were attending legitimate social functions. Laura's art gallery had served a similar function, with expensive artwork transactions masking payments for information and access. Several pieces in her collection had been purchased with funds traced to organizations under investigation by international law enforcement agencies for money laundering and terrorism financing. Has the Queen Consort provided additional information about her children's activities? Dame Rebecca asked, referencing the ongoing debriefing sessions Camilla had been attending since her confrontation with Tom and Laura 6 weeks earlier. Charles's expression tightened slightly at the mention of his wife. The strain on their marriage had become evident to everyone around them, though both maintained the public facade required by their positions. She continues to cooperate fully with the investigation. Her shock at the scope of their activities appears genuine. But the damage to their personal relationship was profound and possibly irreparable. Charles found himself unable to look at Camilla without thinking about the security breaches that had occurred under his roof, the classified conversations that might have been overheard by people who later shared information with hostile foreign agents. The daily briefings had become a catalog of betrayal and deception that extended far beyond Tom and Laura's individual actions. The investigation had uncovered evidence that several other members of their social circle had been engaged in similar activities, creating a web of compromise that threatened the royal family's ability to conduct private business without foreign surveillance. What about prosecution? Charles asked, though he knew the answer would complicate an already impossible situation. Sir Clive exchanged glances with Dame Rebecca before responding. The Crown Prosecution Service believes they have sufficient evidence to proceed with charges against both Parker Bowles' siblings. However, a public trial would expose operational details about royal security that could compromise ongoing protective measures. The impossible choice facing the king was becoming clearer with each passing day. Justice demanded that those who had betrayed their country face legal consequences for their actions. But protecting the monarchy's future security might require allowing the perpetrators to escape public accountability. There's also the question of the Queen Consort's position, Dame Rebecca added carefully. Intelligence services need to be certain that she had no knowledge of her children's activities before we can definitively clear her of any involvement. The suggestion that Camilla might herself be under suspicion hit Charles like a physical blow. The woman he had loved for over 3 decades, who had sacrificed so much to support his role as king, was now being questioned about her potential complicity in activities that threatened the crown she had sworn to serve. What evidence exists to suggest Her Majesty might have been involved? Charles asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the emotional turmoil the question created. Sir Clive consulted his classified files before responding. Several intercepted communications reference conversations with C about royal schedules and family plans. We need to determine whether these refer to the Queen Consort or if the designation indicates someone else entirely. The possibility that his own wife might have inadvertently or deliberately shared information used in intelligence operations was almost too devastating to contemplate. Charles found himself reviewing every private conversation they had shared, wondering which details might have been passed along to Tom and Laura and subsequently exploited by foreign agents. The investigation had already revealed that Tom possessed surprisingly detailed knowledge about upcoming state visits, including security arrangements and private meeting schedules that should have been known only to senior palace staff. Laura had demonstrated similar access to information about the royal family's financial arrangements and investment strategies. How much longer will the investigation require? Charles asked, though he suspected the answer would offer little comfort. At least another month to complete the financial analysis and international cooperation requests, Dame Rebecca replied. Several foreign governments are providing assistance, but the scope of the operation means we're dealing with multiple jurisdictions and competing national interests. The king understood that the crisis would likely extend well beyond the investigation itself. Even if Tom and Laura cooperated fully and provided complete disclosure of their activities, the damage to royal security protocols would require years of rebuilding and reorganization. More immediately pressing was the question of how to manage the public aspects of the family estrangement. Charles's continued silence toward Camilla's children was becoming increasingly difficult to explain without revealing the existence of an ongoing security investigation. "What's our cover story for the media?" he asked, addressing the practical concern that had been weighing on palace communications staff. Sir Clive had been preparing for this question. We're characterizing it as a temporary adjustment in royal schedules due to the king's increased official responsibilities. The palace has issued a statement indicating that some family social arrangements have been postponed pending resolution of state business priorities. But Charles knew that experienced royal correspondents would see through such diplomatic language if the estrangement continued much longer. The British press had elevated speculation about royal family dynamics to an art form, and the complete disappearance of the Parker Bowles family from official events was bound to attract intensive scrutiny. What about Christmas arrangements? Charles asked, referencing the approaching holiday season that traditionally brought extended royal family gatherings. The question hung heavy in the air, highlighting the personal cost of the ongoing crisis. For years, Charles had worked to integrate Camilla's children and grandchildren into royal holiday traditions, creating new customs that honored both the formal requirements of their position and the warmth of family celebration. Now the prospect of Tom and Laura joining royal Christmas celebrations seemed impossible, given the security concerns their presence would create. But excluding them would send a signal to the media and public that something fundamental had changed in the royal family dynamic. Perhaps separate private gatherings could be arranged, Dame Rebecca suggested diplomatically. The Queen Consort could maintain family relationships while ensuring that security protocols are properly observed. Charles nodded, though the suggestion felt like yet another compromise in a series of decisions that were slowly dismantling the life he had built with Camilla. Each security requirement, each protective measure, each necessary restriction was creating distance between him and the people he loved. As the briefing concluded, Charles remained in his study, contemplating the full scope of the transformation that had occurred in his life over the past 6 weeks. The man who had become king determined to modernize and humanize the monarchy was discovering that the institution's survival might require sacrificing the very relationships that had given his reign its emotional authenticity. The silence that had begun as a protective measure was evolving into something more permanent and profound. Charles understood that some betrayals cut too deep to heal completely, and that his duty as sovereign might ultimately require accepting the loss of the family bonds that had sustained him through decades of public service. The chilling realization that he might have to choose between his role as king and his happiness as a husband was becoming harder to ignore. The man who had waited so long to wear the crown was discovering that its weight might be more than any personal relationship could bear. As evening approached, Charles prepared for another dinner alone in his study. Another night of avoiding the woman whose children's actions had forced him into an impossible position. The palace that had once felt like a home was becoming a fortress, and the king was beginning to understand that some fortresses were designed to keep people in as much as they were meant to keep enemies out. The silence that had stunned the palace was no longer just about security or investigation protocols. It was becoming the sound of a marriage and a family slowly breaking apart under the weight of duties that demanded sacrifices no one had anticipated when Charles finally claimed his throne.